without further ado, turn it over to Alicia, who is the Executive Director of New Bridges Immigrant Resource Center. Alicia, take it away. Oh, and then a reminder, if you can, for the rest of you who would unmute or mute yourselves, excuse me, and that way we can kind of minimize interruptions, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I know some of your faces, and it's nice to see you in this format. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current work that New Bridges is doing and how that connects with the reality of the pandemic, as well as some things that have concurrently happened with the pandemic that have to do with administration decisions. And I'd like to then open up the space both for questions and also just almost like a brainstorming session together. I know a lot of you are very engaged in the work of so many things in the community, and there might be a synergy that can happen together as we are talking. So New Bridges is now in its 20th year and was started specifically to serve immigrants in the Shenandoah Valley. And what we have been focusing most of our energy on in the last 5 years has been to support people that are going through the process of paying off large medical expenses, as well as representing people for certain kinds of immigration processes. And both of those things have been highly impacted by the pandemic. As you can imagine, there are a lot of people that have needed to access healthcare services because disproportionately immigrants have been affected by the infections. And so we have been supporting people that are both trying to access good healthcare and also to be able to then pay for it, because regardless of whether or not people have medical insurance, there are often very high deductibles, and so the cost is just very prohibitive. A lot of people should be accessing medical care that are hesitant to do so sometimes because of the high costs that is associated with it. So we accompany people through the process of identifying who all the healthcare providers were that helped them during the emergency or during the care that they needed. How to then organize their information to be able to submit proof of income and all of the applications that are necessary. And then after the healthcare, usually it's the hospital makes a decision, we then follow up with talking with the different healthcare providers that are doctors to be able to inform them of the decision and to follow up with things like if it's necessary to make a payment plan, things like that. So that's been highly impacted by the pandemic currently. And in addition to that, we represent people through an accreditation that we have from the Department of Justice. We represent people before the U.S. Department of Homeland Security with different kinds of immigration processes. So with that, a couple of things have happened concurrently. One is that the Trump administration has really limited certain kinds of processes that people used to have access to, or to maintain processes that people had. And the other thing is that offices have been closed due to the pandemic, and that affects people's capacity to process their paperwork. So let me give you some examples of things that have been limited. The Daca Program, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is one program that it was started as an executive order through President Obama, and then the Trump administration wanted to discontinue the program, and the way that they did it was challenged in court, and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with one of the challenges. However, the Trump administration did not reinstate the program as it once was. There are some limitations. Only the people that already were enrolled in this program can continue in it, and they can only continue in it for a year at a time. So every year, young people that are in this program already would need to pay close to $500 in order to maintain two things that are, well, there are many things that are connected to this, but one thing that I would say is very important to persons that are receiving this benefit is that they are authorized to work. And then the second thing is that they are not accumulating what's called unlawful presence during this time. And that's really important if they would eventually have a pathway to residency and citizenship. So to be able to maintain this well is difficult. The timing of submitting paperwork such that you're able to then get those benefits back on time is a real challenge. So on the one hand, sometimes if people submit it too early and they were approved, some of the time was taken off of their previous, it can shorten the length of time total that a person would have had it. And secondly, if it's not renewed on time, that gap of time means you start unlawful presence during that time. It can also mean that you would lose some benefits like in-state tuition. You wouldn't be able to drive during that period of time. There are a lot of things that are then connected to it at a state level that are affected for young people. So that's a program that was created to be a stopgap because Congress had been unable to pass the DREAM Act, and it continues to be this, 8 years later, it continues to be this program that has been challenged tremendously, and it affects the lives of a lot of young people, young adults that grew up in the United States, have maintained no criminal record, have been completing either higher education or have been able to demonstrate that they are contributing to society in other ways. And so I'm aware that this has been a really stressful time for people that have DACA. In addition, the temporary protected status, which is a status that for a lot of people in this community would have started about 20 years ago, people that came originally from Central America, specifically Honduras and El Salvador, who were told they didn't have to go back to their country of origin once there were some really significant either hurricanes or earthquakes that had happened. So people that were already in the United States, when those natural events happened, were allowed to stay and work and renew their status every year and a half, usually on average. And it was, again, an authorization to work. It didn't allow people to stay here permanently. It was a temporary arrangement. And a lot of communities in El Salvador and Honduras started to depend on these remittances, money that family members from the United States would send in order to help to support them. So the Trump administration has also decided to cancel the temporary protected status, and that has also gone through the courts, and very recently a decision was made through the appeal process that permits this cancellation to happen. And the phase out is going to be, depends on the country, how long it's going to take, but it's very devastating for people to kind of navigate trying to decide if you depend on the possibility of Congress to eventually create something that would allow people to stay, or making decisions that would have some persons of the family possibly staying in the United States if they're US citizens, while others possibly moving abroad. It's just a very stressful time. And all of this happening in the midst of the pandemic. So, it's layer upon layer of distress for a lot of families that are living in this community. In addition, for those who were doing other kinds of immigration processes, the courts have sometimes canceled or postponed, and people don't often find out until right before. And that can happen because, for example, somebody that works in the court system tested positive for COVID. And so the day of, people might find out while they're on the road going to court that they're canceled. There's a postponement of their case. For people that are in ongoing asylum cases, that those court dates are really important. For people who are also wanting to do an interview with the consulate, a U.S. consulate in their country of origin. A lot of those consulates have been closed since March or April, which is stalling indefinitely. Nobody knows. I'm representing people where I don't know when their consulate interview is going to be. And that is causing a lot of distress as family members continue to be separate, since the one family member cannot travel to the United States, and people from the United States are encouraged not to travel other places because we're very, COVID is so prevalent in the United States that a lot of other countries don't prefer to have US citizens travel there at this point. So it's a very uncertain time for a lot of people for many different reasons. And it's an economic reality that is challenging, as well as an immigration systemic reality that is very challenging. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to prioritize our efforts to respond to these kinds of questions in the moment as they arise, because it has been just so very stressful for people. So I don't know if there are questions for clarification. I just threw out a bunch of information, just very, very much, very dense information in the last 10 minutes. So I don't know if anybody has any questions for clarification that would be helpful for you. So if you do, unmute yourself and then go ahead and ask your question. I'll do my best.
Say a little bit about the fund.
Yes. So as a result of a lot of the just people's employment changing very rapidly when the pandemic first started, and the stimulus funding coming out at the same time, which wasn't accessible to families that have mixed status families. So if some of the people in the family are US citizens, but some others are not, then they would not have gotten that check that originally came out in like April and May. So led by a lot of you, there was an effort to start a relief fund that we've been managing in order for people to be able to have some support to pay rent. This has become very, very important for people because some of the funding that is coming through to our local community to be distributed for things like rent are not always accessible to families that have a documentation that doesn't line up with the requirements. So you'll have heard that there is funding available through entities like Mercy House, for example. But some of the requirements are that the person that is accessing this has to have the lease in their own name. They have to be the leaseholders and some other requirements as well. And so not everybody that is in need of that funding is going to be able to access it. You'll also have heard that People Helping People is helping with utility bills, and that's true. And that is regardless of documentation, although the utility bill needs to be in the name of the person that is trying to get the financial support. One of the realities in this maybe, I'm hoping it's going to change, but the requirement has been that people can only access that once every 6 months, just because of the funding availability. I'm hoping that that will become more accessible to people over time. And we've had some moratorium on utility bills, but those will eventually come due. And so as much as people are able to pay into that at this point, it is helpful so that eventually people won't have to figure out how to set up a payment plan or something. There's different possibilities coming through the General Assembly for how people would then address those unpaid utility bills. So having access to the relief fund has been tremendously helpful for people. It's one of those things that, because of the level of crisis that we have at this point, it's sort of an unsustainable crisis. You know what I mean? People, we've been trying as much as possible to identify people that would not have received the stimulus funding, and also people who have not already accessed the fund that we're managing. But it is very clear that this is a chronic issue. And so people that are going to have just a recurring need, it's very difficult to find a way to make life work for people that, even those who have been able to return to work just a bit, maybe not as much as they used to, but that's just really challenging. Thank you for that prompt.
Where does your funding for New Bridges come from?
Most of our funding comes from, it's private. It's from donors, a lot of churches and a lot of individuals. We're a small agency and we keep it fairly bare bones. Our budget this year is around $200,000 and we're 5 of us that work there. We do have a few small grants. We get a grant from the United Way at this point, and also a very small city grant. There is a certain amount of money that they have designated goes to community organizations. So those are 2 grants that we have that are recurring at this point. But there is no guarantee that those will continue. So we try to do some fundraising, which has been challenging right now because we're so focused on actually supporting people. It's challenging to do fundraising in addition, but those are our sources of funding, primarily private. Yeah, so we don't receive federal funding. Yeah.
Are the people who are applying for asylum, are they labeled as TPS, or is there yet another category?
Yeah, TPS is separate from asylum. Asylum, generally speaking, would be for people who have recently entered the United States and believe that their life would be in danger if they went back. People that have TPS, temporary protected status, generally speaking, can't apply for asylum because they have been here so long. And so the time parameters for the deadlines in order for people to apply for asylum are much sooner after people arrive. There are circumstances in which somebody might have entered with a visa, and while they hold that visa that is a temporary visa in the United States for example, studying, or they had 3-year visa through a particular employer, like an employment-based visa. Once in a while, what happens is that their country of origin situation changes drastically, and they know that for particular reasons, their specific life would be in danger if they went back. In that situation, they could apply for asylum because it's sort of an exceptional circumstance, where they came into the United States thinking that they would be able to complete their visa and return home, but now circumstances have really changed. That would be one exception to that 1-year rule. But a lot of the people that would be going to court for asylum would have filed paperwork within a year of when they entered, and now the asylum process is drawn out over several years, and 3 or 4 years later, maybe they'll have a court date. That's going up and down. It used to be a longer wait, and then the Trump administration reorganized some of the folks, and so the recent arrivals were going first, and now it's kind of slowed down again, and so the wait time until court changes a lot. But if you can imagine people that have recently arrived and kind of fled with very little and arrived in the United States are expected to go to court and present a case, which usually is requires legal representation. It's very, very difficult for people to be able to present a successful asylum application, hearing in a hearing without legal representation. A pro se representations where you're representing yourself with no attorney is very difficult to win, even if you have a very compelling case, because you need to show a certain level of documentation of what has occurred for your situation. And so the legal arguments are sophisticated, and that can be challenging for just about anybody. So getting money together to be able to pay for that legal representation is really challenging if you're not legally allowed to work, right? So it's a real issue in how our system is set up.
Alicia, I have a question. My name's Susan Fend, and I work at Second Home Learning Center.
Yes.
And I'm sure you are familiar with many of the families there. I'm hoping there is one family who I know are still not documented,
Mm-hmm.
and the little guy has really bad diabetes, and
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know the process to try to help them. And it's not really my job, but it's just a
Yeah,
concern, how to help them connect with you all.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, so a couple of things that are realities for folks that are undocumented is, on the one hand, there may be no process that currently exists for them to access documentation because of the way our laws are written. So for some families, the documentation issue will be present for a very long time unless there's some comprehensive change to our immigration policies. Okay. And so meanwhile, for those who are in that reality, to be able to access services like healthcare, identifying those providers that are able to support undocumented folks is part of what will help to connect people with. So the Harrisonburg Community Health Clinic, for example, may be a resource. It's a sliding scale, and documentation and also insurance is not a factor to be able to be a patient there. And so that may be an option, and they may be able to also connect the child with a specialist if needed, if there are some needs with the diabetes but there are pediatricians on staff. So at a certain level, that basic care is something that they may be able to access there.
And how would they be able to access would they be able to access some of the financial help that y'all provide, the stimulus?
Yeah, so for the Harrisonburg Community Health Clinic, it's really important that they enroll as patients through the business office and have that vetting happen before they actually see a physician, so that they are determined to be on a sliding scale and what they would then be able to offer in terms of the financial support. For them to be able to access our services, it's just a phone call to our main office. At this point, we are asking people to leave messages, and then the appropriate individual to serve them will be calling them back. So they could have, for example, if they have a medical bill, say this child needed to go to the emergency department because something happened with their diabetic needs, and so they went to the ED. Then they would be able to just call us up and say, we received this bill, and we'll help them to walk through the process, regardless of their documentation status and regardless of their income and their insurance, to be able to access financial support for paying off that medical bill. In addition to that, if they have needs that have to do with paying rent and other things like that, they could access that because of we currently are able to help some with that as well through the relief fund. So they just need to call our main number, and I can give that to you now, or they can find it. Yeah. We're on Facebook. A lot of families find us through Facebook. We also have a website that they can access that. They can Google us. Our brochures are around different places as well. So yeah, what we are pretty careful about right now is that we like to communicate with people first and not do like drop-ins at the office, because of just making sure that we can provide a safe space in the midst of this pandemic. So it's really helpful if people access us by phone first. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Virginia, go ahead.
Yes, years ago I was involved in a class at Parkview Mennonite, and we had a presentation by an immigration lawyer.
Okay.
I would imagine there are maybe a few of those are there in Harrisonburg.
Yeah, there's one primary immigration attorney. Steve Smith is the only attorney locally that is willing to travel to Arlington, which is where the immigration court is located. So if it's a court-related matter, that's really important. We do have a couple of attorneys locally that I call it, and this is something that in the legal world is used fairly commonly. It's crimmigration, which is a combination of both criminal defense and immigration law. It's very important if somebody is charged with a crime to have a really competent attorney to be able to defend the case, because pleading guilty, which is often what is encouraged to do, is maybe not in the best interest of an immigrant who is going through an immigration process or wants to eventually do that, because to have a record is not helpful for immigration processes. And so, as you all know, you can be charged with a crime and not be guilty of it, but our system is set up to encourage people not to go to court. And so we want to get people really good attorneys that can help them to not have a record that would be detrimental for their immigration processes in the future. So we do have some attorneys in town that are knowledgeable enough about immigration processes to be able to do a solid defense that would benefit people that are going through an immigration process as well. So there are a couple of those, but to be honest, we need more. We need more attorneys that only practice immigration law. It's a huge need in our community, but it's not something that a lot of attorneys like to do because it's very complex work and it's not lucrative. It's not something that will bring a lot of funding. It's hard to charge a lot of money for immigration processes because most people can't afford it. And so it's not a popular area of law for most attorneys. So we like having more attorneys in our town if possible. Yes.
All right, Pat, did you have a question? Pat Wingo?
No.
Okay, I just noticed that you were off mute. Sally, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess this is a change of subject, but what kind of volunteer opportunities do you have? Are you actively looking for volunteers, and what kinds of things?
Yeah, so we are actively looking for particular types of volunteers because our office space is a little bit different at this point than it used to be. We don't have as many in-office volunteers that are working directly with clients, but it's been helpful for us to have volunteers that have technical knowledge in certain areas. So if there are people that are able to help with media related, like helping with things like video work, or right now because of the pandemic, that seems to be really helpful to be able to communicate that way, or graphic design knowledge, people that are really skilled in the area of researching grants. We haven't been able to do as much fundraising as we would have liked to this year. And so, you know, a knowledge base when it comes to general grant writing tools is helpful. We're able to access some databases, but it's just an ongoing thing that you have to keep your finger on the pulse of. So, so there are ways that, depending on people's energy and expertise, there are ways to connect. And we're glad to have that kind of conversation. So it's not quite as much working directly with clients at this point. Yeah, but in other ways, yes. Thank you for the question, Sally.
Excellent. Bill Wilson, did you have a question?
No, not yet. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So Alicia, you had mentioned that you thought maybe you wanted to take some time to brainstorm some things. What did you have in mind?
Right, so I know that that Trinity is very engaged in the community, and one of the things that has been very, as we think ahead, regardless of what happens on the 3rd of November, there's going to be a lot of work to be done. You know, on the one hand, if there is a change of administration and we're still in the pandemic, there are things that we need to go back and support people through that have been postponed. And then there are other ways in which we are in need of, I think in this community, just ongoing rebuilding, right? And so I'm curious to know if you all have been in conversation with groups of people that are thinking about that kind of thing. We're in the middle of the crisis, and that's hard to do, but I was curious if there has been conversation about how are people going to be working together in January, February, March, going into the spring, assuming that the pandemic is still going to be a reality. I'm curious to know if you all have been in conversation with groups that are thinking for the next 6 months, for example. Yes, go right ahead, Andy.
Yeah, our new Sanctuary House Church, as a matter of fact, is looking at, okay, where are the edges here now that we can provide some leadership or some general direction. You and I have discussed this. The issue of legal representation, it seems to me to be a very critical area if we can work with some of the lawyers here within other churches and try to build a group, I hate to say it, similar to Vanita, that where it would be legal. It would be legal carrying a client through some process. The other thing I wanted to ask you also, though, are there other groups like New Bridges, say in Charlottesville, or in Roanoke, or in other places where there are the entrance places for immigrant families that you are aware of that work with you all in some sort of a collegial way?
Yeah, so I would say historically we've been in conversation with a group out of Charlottesville named Sin Barreras. It started differently, it had a different model, and part of the reason so they started as volunteers entirely, and then eventually realized that they wanted to be able to add permanent staff. And so we're in conversation with us about how our funding model worked in order to be able to see if they could eventually transition into that kind of model. The difference for them is that Charlottesville has a very different type of legal community. It's larger, and they also have a UVA immigration clinic right there. And so they have access to legal expertise that is pro bono in a way that our community does not have. And so there have been times when there's a particular shift that's happening in immigration law, that there's been a partnership to bring attorneys from the Charlottesville area to Harrisonburg for a one-time, one-day, several-hour event where they have somebody from in my experience, it was somebody that used to work with the Legal Aid Justice Center and is now actually on the faculty at UVA, overseeing the immigration clinic there, that was a presenter, and then had some folks come with them to be able to help support people that in the moment had legal questions. So you can have a legal clinic like that. It's just that it's not ongoing. And so one-day events like that have some limitations, especially if people need some ongoing representation. And there are situations in which people don't feel comfortable coming to a large group presentation as well. It feels very daunting to be in a public space that has been publicly advertised. So in Harrisonburg, having these large gatherings are not quite as successful as they are in some other communities. Even if you have it, like we've hosted those in spaces that are considered to be safer, like Blessed Sacrament, like some other locations in town. It still can feel really daunting to people because in some ways when people gather together and are accessing that kind of help, you're also making public that this is a particular need that you have. And so it's not as anonymous. So Sin Barreras has been a wonderful partner. More recently, I've had a little bit of conversation with a literacy group out of Winchester that recently started some immigration work similar to what my agency does. But they focus mostly on citizenship questions, not entirely, but mostly. And so they're not doing some of the work that would happen as it connects to asylum support. We don't do that representation ourselves, but we help to bridge that for people. So there are a few, I would say. Most of them are located in Northern Virginia, or you'll have a few that are further away, like Richmond and Roanoke and Norfolk. You'll have some over there. But in our general vicinity, it's Winchester and Charlottesville that we're mostly in conversation with. Go ahead.
Let me follow up on that just a little bit.
Sure.
we have three outstanding academic institutions here in the Harrisonburg area, particularly James Madison. And I know that there is a sensitivity at James Madison for immigrant issues.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if there's a way of putting together the synergism of the academic with the grant writing, with the say have a legal, as you say, workshop or something like this that could be expanded out. What about the relationship with, I'll name all three of them, EMU and JMU and Bridgewater.
Sure. Yeah, and Blue Ridge Community College. I'll mention that just because we've had some really good connections with students at BRCC. So this is a pattern that I've noticed is that, well, so there are no law programs locally. So there are ways in which professors are really interested if it allows a connection and a learning experience for their students. So it's not necessarily something where a professor will lend their expertise directly to an agency, but it's more as a learning opportunity for their students. And we've done some work with that. It's really hit or miss in the sense that it depends really on the investment that the students have in the process. And so it depends on how much time we have to invest in the student process in terms of being able to supervise their work and coach them and things like that. So during this pandemic season, we haven't had quite as much time for that. So, you know, and even with grant writing, if any of you have done grant writing, it's really, really important to write things that are realistic and know the agency super well as you're writing so that you can represent the agency correctly. And also to then be able to write out a program that's, that you can actually execute well. One that incorporates what it means for an agency to actually oversee a program and not just like the supplies that are necessary to make something happen. So I think there is some possibility. I think it takes some nuance and some careful conversation, especially if in our particular situation, if New Bridges would need to be very attentive to the student needs, then that's something that I think requires some careful conversation. There are certainly faculty that are very interested in the topic and may have some expertise that they're able to lend to community situations, and that's something that we would definitely welcome conversation over.
Excellent. John, you had a question?
Well, a couple of things I would mention. I mentioned last week or earlier the Blue Ridge Legal Services. They're right there on
on 42.
Street.
Yeah.
And also the Mennonites are traditionally service oriented. So of course, as all of us know, Melody worked with Mennonite Mission for many years, and so a Presbyterian told me years ago that in emergency situations there are just a few organizations that are automatically let in. It's more or less I forget the word, but anyway, Salvation Army, National Guard, and one of them is Red Cross, but also Mennonite Mission. They're all automatically recognized as service people that are automatically recognized to go into a emergency situation like that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning. So New Bridges was started by Mennonites 20 years ago. We're now a nonprofit that is separate from that church structure, but we certainly maintain a lot of relationships with Mennonites, and that's something that's you know, there's ongoing conversation that happens with Mennonite churches at a local level. So Blue Ridge Legal Services is able to support people that are going through an eviction process locally, although they do have parameters about documentation. So they're not able to represent families that that don't have a particular type of paperwork. So they can help some, but not others. The one exception to that, Blue Ridge is able to help people that are going through a situation of domestic violence with more than just the domestic violence representation. But that's the general parameter in terms of who they will accept for documentation purposes. What they don't do that could be really helpful, but at this point, what they don't do is immigration representation, broadly speaking. So they won't do asylum. They wouldn't help somebody that's a victim of certain kinds of systemic issues related to immigration. So John Whitfield, who is the executive director of Blue Ridge Legal Services, is able to explain fairly clearly what they're, what kinds of cases they're currently able to accept. And they would certainly be one of those entities right now that is involved in broader community support. Because of the pandemic, they've been posting some really helpful information regarding the rights of tenants in the midst of evictions. And they have always been known to be an entity that helps people if they have issues with certain kinds of public benefits. So if a family has issues with Medicaid or some other kind of public benefit, they've always been an excellent resource for those types of situations. Yeah, thank you for mentioning those, John.
Any other questions? Yes, Virginia, go ahead.
Hi, Alicia. My name is Virginia. I was just curious if anybody had ever spoken to Washington and Lee's law school.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. So I have Washington and Lee has an immigrant rights clinic, and the professor David Baluarte, who had been the director of it, has now been promoted to associate dean. And so I have been in an ongoing conversation both with Professor Baluarte and now the new director. So yes, and one of our board members is also faculty at the Washington and Lee Law School. So it's a pretty new program. The Immigrant Rights Clinic has been around consistently, I would say, over the last 6 to 7 years. And they've identified what kinds of cases they are most interested in having their students learn about. So the parameters for that kind of partnership is that it must be a case that's during a school year, and it also must be a case that sort of lines up with the student being able to represent this client in court. So the timing has to be just so in order for it to be something where we can make a good referral. But we do appreciate them very much. And they have at times in the past also used our office space in order to be able to meet with people that they would like to support in the Harrisonburg area. So Washington and Lee is fantastic. Wish they were local, wish they were in Harrisonburg. But yes, thank you for mentioning them.
Well, I just want to make sure I thank you, because how you have had to figure out the hoops that need to be jumped for all the people you're trying to help just blows my mind. So thank you for what you're doing.
This is a pretty incredible community, I will have to say. I think I feel like Shenandoah Valley is one of those interesting places because it's both rural and has a concentration of people living in certain towns that is unusual for Virginia in a rural community. And so what I would love in a perfect world is that if things can't come to this area, is that they would become more accessible through better transportation, you know? So if people could hop on a train or a bus in order to be able to access certain kinds of things, that would be lovely. I mean, it's a chronic issue for rural communities to kind of be a bit isolated. And so when we think strategically about the state of Virginia, we're one of those areas that's a little bit challenged, as is southwest portion of Virginia, you know? And so, so when I say that I welcome creativity and people that are wanting to sort of think through ideas, it's a very sincere desire to kind of realize that, you know, sometimes we get stuck in a bubble. And so how can we think beyond that? And who are the partners in conversation that would be able to help us to think, you know, strategically for the medium term, right? And so that's, yeah. Thank you so much for your encouragement, but keep those thinking caps coming, because that's really important to us in the midst of all of this.
Excellent. We're running a little over time here, but Virginia does have one last question. Go ahead.
Isn't there a bus service between Blacksburg and that stops in Harrisonburg and goes to?
Yeah, there is a bus line. It's fairly limited in terms of how many times it comes through. It comes through once a day and comes back through once a day. And so it may not line up with, for example, an early morning appointment in Northern Virginia, and people aren't able to spend the night the day before in order to be able to make it sometimes to the next day. So there is something that didn't exist before that is really helpful, but it's not frequent enough at this point in order to get people exactly where they need to go. So if you're talking about an interview with the Department of Homeland Security or in the court system, it's not quite what we need yet. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, Alicia, thank you so much for your time this morning, and for all that great information. You do wonderful work in the community. If there are no more questions, I'm not seeing any more hands. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, I was just thinking as you were mentioning the
Oh, Lauren, I think we lost you. You've frozen up on us. Oh dear.
I access the expertise of people outside the area through Zoom and maybe from your office if they don't have connectivity in their own homes. But you know, as people are staying home more and working from home more and moving around less, it's a challenge, but could it also be a blessing for accessing expertise that is completely out of this area? And are any court proceedings happening online instead of in the courtroom? And, you know, is that just, I'm sure you've already thought of it, but it occurred to me that.
Thank you, Lauren. I think I heard part of what you said, and that has to do with, is this an opportunity currently, since people are having to use technology so much more than they used to be able to access certain kinds of resources that generally would have required travel. There is a certain amount of that happening in the sense that some legal providers are willing to meet via video, but a lot of the folks that we work with, the adults, are not used to using technology. Younger people are becoming more and more familiar, but it can be a challenge for adults, and it would still require in some situations that actual physical like signatures and things happen and are at least scanned, so that infrastructure is necessary. And so we've been trying to work around that. Unfortunately, most meetings are not happening via Zoom. You would hope, right? But yeah, the court system is not very accessible via video at this point. Once in a while, a detained individual might be able to do something over video, but generally most people are not.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions for Alicia, again, thank you for your time. Thanks to all of you for coming in for Nurture Time today. Oh, excuse me. Next week, I got choked up about it. Next week, we'll be talking about the Keister Backpack Program with Dane Byers. So please join us back for that. If there's something else, I'm going to go get a drink of water. You all have a lovely week. Take care.